Welcome to another edition of Resource PNG. In this episode, we talk to the Executive Director of the Institute of National Affairs, Paul Barker, about a range of issues: the PNG government's takeover of the Oktedi mine and PNG SDP's role to date in the Western Province and the country, the value of Newcrest mine, the Kumul entities and the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the LNG industry. In this segment, we hear Paul Barker's take on the PNG government's plans to buy out PNG SDP's shares of the Oktedi mine. Mr. Barker, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
What will the PNG government's takeover of the Oktedi mine mean for the people of Western Province?
Well, it's all, I'd have to say, still uncertain. They're calling it, some people are referring it as a nationalisation, but of course the irony is that it already belongs to the people of Papua New Guinea and particularly to the people of Western Province. So at the moment, 52% of the mine is owned by PNG Sustainable Development Programme, and the rest is essentially owned by the government of Papua New Guinea already. So the shareholding owned by PNG Sustainable Development, the benefits of that go largely to the people of Western Province and partly to the people of the rest of the country. And it has to be said that PNG STP has been managing and maintaining the money that they have received over the years from the mine in a pretty responsible manner. The money has accumulated and it's been safeguarded. There can be criticisms of PNG STP for perhaps the implementation of some projects. Sometimes they've been a bit slow, but on the other hand, when you consider how the government, national government and the provincial government in Western Province over the years has managed and utilised money, PNG STP has been managing it more effectively probably than those government entities. So it would seem more logical for the government, national government, to try and work more closely together with PNG STP and align their expenditure so as to have the most impact, rather than going for this move of a takeover. Clearly, there are legal questions that relate to the takeover, and I think the people of Western Province in particular could feel some sort of concern that maybe they're forfeiting a substantial level of ownership in the mine to the national government through such a move if it does proceed. I just say if it does proceed, the government has made quite a number of announcements on a number of things over the last period of time, and there have been some good ideas, some big initiatives and so on. But sometimes, as with, for example, the decision to change back from the OBE system in education within 3 weeks, it was just practically impossible to introduce a new curriculum and apply it train up all the teachers and then apply it within a course of 3 weeks. So sometimes the government, after they've had a chance to sort of consult and consider, they sometimes modify a position. So I think it may not be set in stone, but certainly the people of Western Province would be probably the party that would have the most to lose if the national government decided to take it over. And the question is, why would the national government really want to take it over? Yes, maybe it's a stance that they're trying to take vis-a-vis demonstrating, well, look, you know, it's ours and it's no longer BHP's. Well, it isn't BHP's anymore anyway. It belongs to the people of Papua New Guinea. But maybe it's also because the national government is looking for equity in some entities that they could actually use to mortgage to be able to borrow internationally for other ventures, in the same way as the national government did with its equity in Oil Search, to be able to borrow, to be able to buy up the 19.5% state and provincial government, etc., equity in PNG and LNG. So that could be one of the reasons why the national government's wanting to do it, to be able to borrow for a variety of its international ambitions, including, for example, Exim banks, but also potentially for being able to buy into some future LNG and other mining ventures. So these are some of the ideas. But in terms of the most effective utilisation of funds, it would seem that probably the best arrangement would be to stick with the PNG STP at the moment, to better align planning and expenditure, so that there's no duplication. Better align national government, provincial government, right through to district and LLG with the expenditure that PNG STP has. Now, one of the concerns sometimes with PNG STP is it instead of focusing on the full range of activities at the local level, it has gone in for a number of very large projects like the port facility in an international port facility and the large proposed hydroelectric scheme in the Parari. Now, these are schemes to a large extent which are perhaps not driven by local need. There are maybe better ways of spending money to have more of an impact on the ground within Western Province, but even around the rest of the country. So, yes, for the government to work with the company perhaps to focus. But I think that's happening anyway, because I think PNG STP is probably reappraising their position with some of those large projects and realizing that the demand isn't immediately there. The demand in PNG is for port facilities all around the country. They all need major investment and reinvestment to upgrade Moresby, Lae, Rabaul, etc. And it perhaps would be more useful for the PNG, for the people of Western Province to actually hold equity in those and get long-term revenue from those port infrastructure rather than a large port facility down near Daru, which perhaps could turn into a white elephant if there's no real demand and no real supply. So that's one issue. And the hydro dam in the Parari. Again, every town and sub-district in Papua New Guinea is crying out for power. Industry is crying out for power. So maybe again, a better use of funds from PNG STP would be installing hydro and other power facilities for the existing towns and villages in Western Province and around the country. They are in fact doing that in Western Province to some extent. They are installing power down to the local village level, but around the rest of the country, rather than a big power facility which is really geared to exporting power to Australia. So a little bit of refocusing, sitting down at the same table, dialogue between Prime Minister and the Chairman and Managing Director of PNG STP would probably be able to align programs more usefully for the government and the people of Western Province than this takeover exercise. Although, as I say, that may be being introduced partly also for this equity reason. But is that really, that wouldn't necessarily be something that would be particularly in the interests of the people of Western Province. And the people of Western Province, let's face it, they have had limited benefits from the Oktedi mine. The major part of the benefits from the Oktedi mine over the last 20 or so years has been the revenue to the government. It has been the largest, or one of the largest, depending on the year and the commodity prices, one of the largest providers of revenue to the national government constantly. The benefits to Western Province have been more limited, but they have been building up, and they're particularly building up through the Oktedi Development Foundation, but particularly through PNG Sustainable Development Programs. So.
We'll continue our chat with Paul Barker after the break. Welcome back. In this segment, we talk about the value of the Oktedi mine. Paul Barker, the Executive Director of the Institute of National Affairs, gives his view on what he thinks the government is willing to pay for PNG STP shares. So Makera admitted that PNG STP won't get the full $1.1 billion value of the mine. How much do you think the government is likely willing to pay? And can the government really decide on any price of PNG STP shares?
It's clearly in the interest of the national government to try and obtain them as cheaply as possible, but on the other hand, they don't want to down value, because they want to clearly demonstrate. If, for example, they want to use the equity in the mine as a vehicle for securing borrowings, they want to ensure that the mine valuation is as high as possible. So I won't come up with a figure, it's certainly in PNG STP's interest to ensure that they get as much as possible, and the government's to make sure it's as economic as possible. But the issue that, as highlighted by the PNG STP and by the chairman and managing director at the recent AGM, was that if the national government really does take over the ownership of the mine and the dividends effectively go to the national government, it will mean that PNG SDP, instead of being an entity that provides, at the moment, 60% of its, it has a division between what it provides for the province and what it provides for the rest of the nation. But clearly what they would end up having to do is just to become focused on Western Province, utilizing the funds that they've already accumulated, I think at 1.3 billion already accumulated, that's US dollars, in Singapore and in international investments. So they would then just utilize those funds for providing long-term benefits to the people of Western Province. But it would just be drawing down on an existing endowment fund effectively, and not be being topped up by the future dividends from the mine, assuming that the mine gets a mine extension, because at the moment it's scheduled to be ending now, but the mine extension would give it another 10 years lease of life, providing that revenue which clearly the national government is interested in obtaining a larger portion of, but which otherwise PNG STP would be receiving and then continue to be utilising for Western Province and for what it does at the moment, a range of projects around the rest of the country. Because all around the country they're investing in and providing support, for example, for cocoa in Kaka and East New Britain, facing the cocoa pod borer. They're providing funding for some power projects and a wide range of community level projects all around the rest of the country. Clearly that part, as stated in the AGM recently, would all have to cease, and they would then just focus on Western Province using the accumulated fund. And effectively the link with its funder, on which it had the 52% shareholding, i.e. the Ok Tedi mine, would then effectively be severed. Although you'd still presumably have the Ok Tedi Foundation, which is the mine's own community service obligation entity, that would presumably still exist and would still be providing local community service, and there would still be an important function of aligning PNG STP's programs with the Ok Tedi Foundation.
Stay tuned for more discussion with Paul Barker. You're back with Resource PNG. In our interview with Paul Barker, Executive Director of the Institute of National Affairs, we've spoken about the government's takeover of the Ok Tedi mine and how this will affect the people of Western Province. We now talk about Hidden Valley and Newcrest mine simplifying their operations after writing down their value by 6 billion Australian dollars. Newcrest is aiming to simplify its operations at Lihir and Hidden Valley gold mines after writing down the value of its mines in PNG, Australia and Africa by 6 billion Australian dollars. The PM said that his government would consider offering assistance if that was warranted. What are your thoughts on all that is happening with Newcrest, and given the circumstances they are in, what should their approach be in PNG?
Well, it's an unfortunate situation. The Lihir mine started in the mid-1990s. It is a very large resource, and it took quite a long time to actually start, because it was going to be clearly an expensive mine to develop and operate. It involved new technology, state-of-the-art technology, partly because of the temperatures that they're operating at. And Newcrest bought out Lihir Gold a few years ago, and I think they paid something like 10 billion for it. It was an expensive investment. Recently, Newcrest was valued as a company as a whole at 30 million Australian dollars. I understand that their valuation is only about a third of that now. So they've been really hit, particularly because of these high costs at Lihir and the problems that they've had at Lihir. They are the biggest of the single current gold mining operations in PNG. You've got obviously a major company, Barrick Gold, operating up in Porgera, but in terms of the investment, the level of investment and commitment within PNG at the moment, Newcrest is the biggest player, and it is important for the government that they really do maintain that the company health is sustained, and they do maintain their commitment and their investment, because they are also a 50% partner in Hidden Valley, and the plan is for Hidden Valley to, as it were, progress to Wafu Golpi mine further up the Markham Valley, or near the Markham Valley, which is a very substantial potential copper mine. But again, it will be a mine which involves something like a 10 billion investment. It's a very expensive mine to develop, partly because the resource is very deep and there isn't a resource at the surface to help fund the development of the resource deep down below, as occurred with the cap of gold, as it were, in Oktedi. So, yes, clearly that the Wafi mine seems to be a little bit on hold at the moment because of the global market, all the commodity prices in minerals, but also across the board in agriculture. They were all well down now off what they were a year ago. The global financial markets are putting restraint on any new mining developments, and so the new mining developments which will be occurring in PNG over the next period of time are the ones that are probably the easiest and the cheapest to develop, or the most advanced. And things like Wafi probably somewhat on hold because of the level of financial exposure for PNG and the disinclination worldwide for new ventures at this minute of time, until commodity prices start showing good signs of recovery. But at the moment, yes, it's important that Newcrest hangs in there, that they overcome their problems. They have invested a lot of money in technology, replacement equipment in Lihir to enable it to have a new lease of life, to make sure that the production costs start coming down there in Lihir, and those reform measures, the government needs to sort of work closely with them to make sure that they are a long-term sort of major player and committed to future activities in the country. That includes renegotiations with the landowners, and perhaps sort of downgrading some expectations on the part of landowners and all players, government, provincial government, and so on. On the other hand, when you're dealing with mining companies, the national government can't go completely soft, because invariably any major investor wants to limit their tax commitments, and we know that some mining projects, maybe the Ramu nickel mine with all the exemptions on labour and tax holidays and so on, you have to wonder what the benefits to the country are at the end of the day. So the government has to be able to work from a position of strength to fully ascertain the situation and what the actual costs are, and not go completely soft. But certainly the government needs to be able to listen, to understand, and to be able to adapt. And one of the problems that mines and any investor has in Papua New Guinea is partly relates to some of the high costs of operating in PNG. And some of those issues are that the national government in many countries in the world provides a range of public goods that in Papua New Guinea are not really provided, or are not very reliable. Transport infrastructure, law and order, service provision, power provision, procedures that relate to migration, and a range of other issues like that. Now, obviously, Lihir it's effectively out there on its own as an island, and everything is virtually run by the company. So all costs are borne really by the company, and of course the company provides the support to the whole of the rest of the island community, and of course to New Ireland province as well. but listening, understanding, so that the government isn't, as it were, taken for a ride, but really is able to provide practical support that will enable the mine to function, to be viable and profitable, but also that the people of the island of Lihir, New Ireland, and the national government that is able to ensure that it gets a good, sound and long-term benefit from, as I say, what is a major resource and still is a long-term resource.
We'll have more when we return. Thanks for staying with us on the show. Continuing on with our interview with Paul Barker, we ask him about the LNG industry and what developments are surfacing in the sector, particularly with Talisman Energy and Horizon Oil's presence in the Gulf and Western Province. We also hear how the market for LNG may be more lucrative than the mining industry. LNG, what's the latest update, especially with plans for Horizon to come on board in a big way?
Well, it's interesting, as I say, over the course of time, there's been a bit of a hold on the new mining projects because of the low commodity prices. So a lot of the explorers in mining have put their development plans on hold or have been forced to put them on hold by the finance sector. LNG is also, the hydrocarbons, oil and gas are also experiencing lower prices thanks to, amongst other things, but particularly the new available oil and gas sources, particularly this fracking that's developed now for extracting oil seam gas, etc. in the United States. So, for example, the United States, which was a major importer of oil and gas until now, is suddenly turning around and looking like an exporter. It's controversial, fracking, the environmental concerns over the impact, including on potential contamination of water supplies. But it does look as if in the last few years the global energy scenario has somewhat changed. So those prices are lower. Nevertheless, in PNG, the LNG side seems to be pressing ahead in a way that the mining side isn't at the moment. The market and the financial market seems readier to be providing that level of support. Clearly, with PNG LNG, you have major players. You obviously have the major shareholders, one of the world's largest oil companies, Exxon, as the operator and major shareholder, but also its partners, Oil Search and the national government, of course, and subnational. So one of the issues that is probably encourages investors as well is the idea of tapping into the existing infrastructure. If you can avoid all the overhead costs of constructing completely new infrastructure, lots of new pipelines, new processing facilities, you can get the costs of production and you can get a new resource to market more readily, more quickly. And so with the Antelope Elk resource that's being developed by Interoil, and clearly Interoil needs some major partners in there, and progress seems to have been being made with respect to that. You have also in Western Province some major new LNG discoveries, and you have some big players, including Horizon. You also have, of course, Talisman, which has strung together a load of resources from a number of smaller players. So you've got this consolidation exercise between several of the larger companies. And as I say, they may develop their own independent plans, but the capacity to link into the existing infrastructure, that may not always please everyone on the ground who may like the idea of having infrastructure in their own province, like Gulf or Western. But in reality, if you can avoid all the added cost of a major processing facility, it actually makes the operation, as I say, more profitable, makes it more viable. It makes it potentially come into operation earlier. And if it is more profitable, that also means that the government is going to potentially make more money, maybe as a shareholder, if the government chooses to take up shares in these projects, take up its option, but also particularly from taxation. So if something is profitable, then you can be securing basically income tax for the national government and the provincial government. So it would actually probably be more useful and valuable for Gulf and Western to see processing at existing facilities rather than new processing. Now that doesn't seem immediately logical, because people will say, but if you have a processing facility on the spot, clearly there will be a lot of extra jobs. Well, yes, during the construction phase there's a lot of extra jobs, but as we've seen with PNG LNG, quite a lot of those jobs go to overseas workers anyway. But in the long term, when you have operations up and running, LNG, it provides very few jobs. The whole of PNG LNG is probably only going to be providing something like 600 jobs, sustainable jobs. And many of them are going to be fairly low salary positions like security guards. So the benefit for LNG to PNG and to provinces like Western and Gulf is from the revenue side. It's not going to be directly from the employment side. So that is where it is so crucial that the government uses those funds, really prioritizes those funds, puts it into human resource development, education, health, technical skills, so that when jobs come up, whether they're temporary jobs or longer term jobs, that Papua New Guineans are getting them, and one doesn't need to import a load of overseas workers for them, but also in road and other basic infrastructure to enable existing operations to happen. Take, for example, in Western Province, whereas we say the Horizon and the Talisman activities are particularly occurring, they are also occurring in offshore exploration and development in the Gulf. But for example, with Octedi, one of the major benefits from Octedi has been that it has been able to cross-subsidize or support the development of a rubber industry. The vessels that travel up and down carrying cargo into Octedi and basically the containers are able to carry out rubber. They're empty containers, so it's no cost really to Octedi, but effectively they're subsidizing the rubber industry, and that is providing something like 10,000 people with employment in Western Province. Clearly, these sorts of benefits are critical, and so it's, as the major benefit from LNG is not jobs directly, but is revenue, it's critical that money is not frittered away, as we know the national and the provincial government has been doing over the course of a number of years, as demonstrated by by the Public Accounts Committee and the Auditor General, large amounts of money abused and misused. So a focus, and the government is saying, a major focus is on anti-corruption, targeting, managing the funds more effectively, targeting, all crucial. All crucial. They don't go into lots of grand new projects, many of which may turn out to be white elephants, but into restoring existing roads, upgrading existing roads, and some further upgrades and some new infrastructure, but very, very carefully targeted. All around the country, existing facilities, technical training colleges are completely run down. They don't have equipment, so people don't get trained on equipment, and certainly not new equipment. So employers say, well, they're not very useful for the workforce. These sorts of investments in human resource capital are crucial if Papua New Guinea is going to make sure that it benefits and participates in the resource extraction process, and that it's not just frittered away in money being invested in cairns in overseas or just consumed in imported goods.
We continue with this interview when we return. The Kumul entities, that is, the Kumul Holdings and the Kumul Trust Fund, that were set up to separately manage the mining and petroleum assets as well as state-owned entities. But how different will they be from the proposed Sovereign Wealth Fund? We find out as we continue our interview with Paul Barker. The Kumul Trust Fund and Kumul Holdings, will that be separate from the Sovereign Wealth Fund?
Now, that's a very good question. That's something that we would really like to know. The government, over a course of some years, has been developing the Sovereign Wealth Fund concept, which is a well-established mechanism in countries that are relatively resource-rich. Sovereign wealth funds around the world, they are ranked, as it were, or rated in accordance with something called the Santiago Principles, as to whether they are very well managed and transparent or not very well managed. So if you get a score near a 10, it's a very well managed fund, and it will have a major potential value for the country. So countries like Norway, which has a major sovereign wealth fund and future fund, states in the United States like Alaska, and provinces in Canada like Alberta, but also some of the Middle Eastern countries, they all have sovereign wealth funds which are ranked at the high level. And so those funds are very carefully, transparently managed, very accountable. The public is fully aware of them, and that the funds belong to the people of that country for whatever the purposes that are determined. Sometimes they're more like pension funds, sometimes they're like future funds, sometimes they have multiple purposes for stabilization and for investment, cross-investment into other sectors like agriculture. But it's critical that the fund is managed to that high level, because if it's somewhere down on that low level under those Santiago Principles, then we're going to see the funds are misused, they're not transparent, they're not accountable, and we'll have the scenario which we had a little bit in the 1990s with the old with the Mineral Resource Stabilization Fund, where the fund effectively became useless. It was a sort of pre-sovereign wealth fund. We have an example of quite a well-run sovereign wealth fund at the moment. It's not a national sovereign wealth fund, but in fact PNG STP, the fund that they are managing there, has been well managed. You can argue about some of the projects, but they have been funding a very large number of projects and activities. But in terms of the fund management itself, invested offshore so as partly to be safeguarded, but also to limit the impact on the PNG currency. If you have a major build-up of currency within the country, you have that Dutch disease potential impact where you can actually be forcing the kina up. And if the kina is forced up, then it undermines the competitiveness of all the other industries, and it's the other industries that create the employment. Agriculture, we know, is 80% of employment plus in the country. Manufacturing, well, much of the manufacturing in Papua New Guinea is associated with the production of agricultural products, agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and so on. So it's crucial that the Sovereign Wealth Fund is managed to the highest standard possible, and it really needs to be linked, independent, but linked with the Treasury or the financial institutions within government. Suggestions that it may be linked with the state-owned enterprises, IBBC, or with the proposed Kumul Trust Fund and the Kumul Holdings cause a fair amount of nervousness. It then looks as if the Sovereign Wealth Fund might start being used again as a mortgage mechanism for borrowing money for projects now. And this is like mortgaging for expenditure now at the cost of the future generations. Whereas the Sovereign Wealth Fund should be being built up, accumulated, being used for supporting, for example, some routine expenditure on crucial activities like maintenance, some basic service provisions, routines to make sure that they are not affected unduly by the swings and troughs of commodity prices. But it should not be mortgaged in advance, because that's exactly what happened to the Mineral Resources Stabilization Fund in the 1990s. They effectively mortgaged the fund, so even before it was spent, it was already it was pre-committed, so it had no stabilization role whatsoever. And as the Sovereign Wealth Fund for PNG would be intended to provide a stabilization role, sanitizing the revenue coming in, particularly during the periods when the prices are higher and more revenue is coming in, but also to for other purposes the government may plan, so cross-investment into other activities. But it should be based on the accumulation, not on it being pre-committed. So there are a lot of questions about the Kumul funds, the governance of the Kumul funds. I'm not sure how far, we know there's already a cabinet decision in relation to it, but I'm not sure how far the government has actually worked it all out. I think there's still quite a bit of discussion going on, and there should be, because it came along, the documentation that I've seen and others have seen demonstrates that there's a little bit of loose thinking in there. There's a bit of a mix-up of activities. What is administration? What is management? What are the mechanisms of accountability? So it requires quite a bit more work. It would benefit from a lot more discussion with some people with a lot of experience in this field, both with financial issues and fiscal management, but also in the private sector in relation to corporate entities.
More with Paul Barker. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In this final segment, we continue our interview with Paul Barker about the Kumul entities and the Sovereign Wealth Fund.
There are some good ideas in the Kumul arrangements. For example, separating the petroleum from the gas probably is a sound arrangement. The separation from the mining from the hydrocarbons, oil and gas, is probably sound because they require a level of specialism of their own. The fact that at the moment you've got Petromin, which potentially was set up for both oil and gas, and you've got a separate national oil company, or what was Croton, that came about because of some rather unique circumstances at the time. They were both set up under the same government. It seemed illogical, but there were certain reasons why that happened. But separating those two functions has a certain logic. But the idea of probably the best idea with Kumul Holdings would actually to maintain IPPC and to consolidate on some of the good reforms that were being made on IPPC, particularly during the time when Sir McCary was the Minister for State-Owned Enterprises, getting the accounts to be more prepared and made publicly available in a timely manner, setting clear yardsticks for them to operate, making good comparisons, and where entities didn't need really to be under the government and perhaps could have been better performed by the private sector, maybe to even privatize them, or at least to open up these activities to competition. These would all be areas where you could get improved performance and efficiency and better, cheaper, and more reliable services to the people of Papua New Guinea, which is, what those state-owned enterprises are providing key functions of power and utilities, some telephone services and so on. We know that the costs of these service provisions in PNG are phenomenally high by international standards, phenomenally unreliable. So, for example, with power, every business, for example, has to have a backup generator, and in many cases they're not just backup generators, they're the main generators. So consolidating, getting those organizations to work more efficiently, partnering, bringing in private capital to invest in those activities under PPP arrangements, or letting competitive services, or allowing private companies to supply to the grid, to produce their own power and to sell to the grid, as is now occurring up at Hidden Valley, as is occurring with New Britain Palm Oil, producing methane-based power from oil palm, putting that into the grid. These are all very constructive, but consolidating that IPPC model might be the best way to go, but with the Kumul Holdings idea, rather than trying to make some complete major reforms. But certainly it will cause a lot of concern if in any way they start mixing up the Sovereign Wealth Fund with the Kumuls. I mean, there are also concerns over the Kumuls, over the nature of these trusteeships with the Prime Minister and all the former Prime Ministers being the shareholders. You know, questions about, well, on what basis are they the corporate shareholders? Do they have a particular experience in corporate management that it would be set in law? What basis or what mechanism do those prime ministers to have to resign? If they wish to resign, they may have conflicts of interests because they may be major shareholders or board members in other resource boards and so on. So it may not be something that they all want in any case, but it is a mechanism which, yes, we understand has been applied in Singapore, but PNG is not Singapore. Singapore is a country which has got the highest sort of standards of governance and accountability, and where there are very severe penalties for any misappropriation and any problems by any public officials. And PNG, we know, yes, the government's made a strong commitment to improving governance, tackling corruption using the Operation Clean Sweep and so on. But at this stage, a lot of those arrangements, commitments to the ICAC, a range of other plans and commitments, they're still in the drawing board or just starting. So we haven't got yet the evidence that they are actually being applied. We haven't got major increases in funding for the Auditor General, which is essential to oversight of the expenditure by the national government, by subnational governments, and right down to the LLGs, where a lot more money is being pumped under the 2013 and subsequent budgets. So we need to see the evidence on the governance systems sort of really being reinforced, and so trying to sort of just copy a model from Singapore when we don't have the mechanisms in place maybe is problematic.
Mr. Barker, thank you very much for your time on the show.
Thank you very much.
That ends this edition of Resource PNG. For any comments, queries or suggestions, do email us on this address, resourcepng@mtv.com.pg. Or to find out more, check MTV online. That's www.mtv.com.pg, and go to our Resource PNG page. And you can also check our page on Facebook. Until another edition of Resource PNG, enjoy your viewing.